I think we'll get started. I think we have a few more people that are coming, but we're going to get started anyway. I wanted to say good afternoon and tell you my name is Ruth Dunkel. I'm the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs, and I'm here. I would be here sitting in the audience, but I'm here because Laura Lane is ill today. So she's at home, but she sends Robert her best wishes. Today is a very happy day for the School of Social Work as we welcome you to the installation of Dr. Robert Joseph Taylor as the Harold R. Johnson Professor of Social Work. It's not often that we have the opportunity to install one of our own faculty in an endowed chair. And we are particularly happy that Robert Taylor, who is a very well-established gerontologist and has been on our faculty since 1991, is receiving this honor. Thank you for joining us for the celebration of Robert Taylor, but also for the opportunity to recognize our former dean, Harold Johnson, who's sitting in the front row, for whom the chair is named. Both of these faculty members, present and emeritus, have a strong commitment to scholarship and service to gerontological social work. Let me tell you a little bit about the Harold R. Johnson Professorship in Social Work that was established by the Regents of the University of Michigan in 1994 as the first fully endowed professorship for the School of Social Work. It was established in recognition of Harold R. Johnson's many contributions during his tenure as Dean of the school from 1981 to 1993, his directorship of the Institute of Gerontology, as well as his important roles in education, service, and research at the University of Michigan. And now I would like to invite the recipient of the Harold R. Johnson Professorship in Social Work, Dr. Robert Joseph Taylor, to come forward. So Robert, on behalf of the University of Michigan School of Social Work, I'm pleased to name you the Harold R. Johnson Professor of Social Work to commemorate this professorship and to recognize your scholarship in the field of gerontology. I present to you this chair. We are all very, very proud of you. Congratulations. I know everybody laughs when we give somebody a chair who's getting a chair, but this is the physical form of the chair, but the chair, the symbolism of the chair really is far more extensive and quite a prestigious circumstance for any faculty member to be in. Before I proceed and talk a little bit more about Robert's career here, I thought maybe Harold would like a moment to talk about the chair that's in your name and the importance of it for Robert.
Pardon my remaining seated. I'm recovering from a recent hospitalization, so I feel fortunate to be here. Of course, I wanted to be here because I look forward to Robert's installation and serving as the Harold R. Johnson Professor. I've been impressed with his work over the years and look forward to a very bright future, brighter. And just thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We're delighted that you could be with us, Harold. Now I have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about Professor Taylor, and with this introduction I hope it'll be obvious why he is the perfect choice to receive this chair. He is a valued faculty member at the School of Social Work, where he has served the school as the Associate Dean for Research for 7 years, as well as serving as a faculty associate for the Program for Research on Black Americans at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research, where he currently serves as director. Professor Taylor has published extensively on the informal social support networks of adult and elderly Black Americans, having published 3 books, 133 journal articles, and 41 book chapters. He was principal investigator for several projects funded by the National Institutes of Aging that examined the role of religion in the lives of Black and white elderly adults. He was co-principal investigator with James Jackson, who's also here. Where are you, James? There you are. Good. On several grants from the National Institute of Mental Health on the correlates of mental health and mental illness among Black Americans, including the only major national study of the prevalence of mental illness among Black Americans. Of his 3 books, he has edited 2, one on family life in Black America and aging in Black America with James Jackson and the School of Social Work professor Linda Chatters. He is also lead author of the book Religion in the Lives of African Americans, Social, Psychological, and Health Perspectives with Professor Chatters and Jeff Levin. He is the founding editor of the African American Research Perspectives and currently on the editorial boards of the Journal of Marriage and the Family and Race and Social Relations. Today, Robert will be delivering his endowed chair lecture, and the title of which is Family and Social Support Networks of Older African Americans.
Let me just first mention it is an absolute pleasure being here. It's an absolute pleasure having my family and friends in the audience. I am humbled and overwhelmed at this honor. This is something I never really expected, and am happy to serve in this chair. So let me get started. These are the topics that I'm going to cover. Just a quick overview. The segregation and civil rights will deal with my upbringing in Nashville, Tennessee. So, this is my home. This picture was just taken 2 weeks ago. This is my nephew standing in front of our old family home. It was built around, I think, like 1954, something like that. Even though it is very small, in our working, the middle class Black community, according to my older family members, we used to give tours of this house. I grew up in the Jim Crow South, and segregation was everywhere. It is so intrusive, it is really hard to explain how intrusive it was. At Black schools, children got second and third hand books as new books. YMCAs were second class and segregated. I had a friend on a junior high school team. He practiced football every day in the cold, and he never played a game because white schools and Black schools could not play each other. Boy Scouts were segregated. Everything was segregated. Again, it's really hard to imagine. Right now, what we tend to see in pictures is just water fountains. It's hard to imagine the level. This is a picture of the Tennessean movie theater. Black people could not go to that movie theater or any movie theater in downtown Nashville, except one, which was the Paramount. But then you had to sit in the balcony. I was protected from much of that because my mother just wouldn't let us go. So a lot of the heavy-duty discrimination I was totally protected from, solely because my mother was very clear, no, you cannot go there, and that's that. I want to warn you, I have pictures of all my siblings in this presentation. This is a picture of my brother in a 2013 Tennessee State game. He does a lot of fundraising for Tennessee State. Tennessee State's a historically Black college. But the difference between my family's upbringing and my upbringing is I was in the first wave of integration. I had the opportunity to go to other schools. My family members did not have that opportunity. I want to make sure that we understand that this is not solely a Southern issue. Carol Simpson, as you see here, many of you may remember her on Weekend News. Carol Simpson, as you see, is a University of Michigan grad. When she attended University of Michigan, she could not live on campus. This is Z. Alexander Luby. He was a neighbor. He was a friend. He went to our church. You see the circle? It's hard to see it here. That's, if you can see the man who circled, that's Z. Alexander Luby. He was a civil rights, I shouldn't call him a civil rights attorney. He was an attorney for students in the civil rights movement. At these types of cases, and what you don't see here is these are lawyers talking to a judge, but when he would talk, the judge would turn away. So just as I'm talking now, as soon as Attorney Luby would talk, the judge would do like this. Again, not uncommon during this time period. This is our childhood church. Again, Attorney Luby was a member of that church. And as I said, he lived in our neighborhood. He probably lived from here, maybe where Michigan Union is. That's to give you some perspective. Okay. And this is his bombed house. It woke me up. It woke my brother up. Didn't wake up one of my sisters. I always mess with her about that. If you look at the right, the picture on the right, you can see through. This is on the interior of the house, and you see Meharry Medical College. This is windows broken at Meharry Medical College from that blast. And if you look straight in the back, that's where you see Attorney Luby's house. Because of that blast, on the exact same day, there was a march. There had been lots of sit-in movements, lots of students being arrested. But because of that, there was a march. And that march went to the city capitol. It was led by Diane Nash, who's in the middle. And to our left, is Reverend C.T. Vivian, both who are still alive. Again, a picture of the march. This is them confronting the mayor about civil rights and about, in particular, lunch counters. This is the next day at a rally at Fisk University where I used to play a lot of basketball. And as you see, Attorney Luby has broken down crying. Attorney Luby and his wife were not hurt because, fortunately, their bedrooms were in the back. So they were not physically hurt. Obviously, we don't know the extent of any post-traumatic stress or anything else that may have happened. That's a picture of that same rally at Fisk University. This is a picture of Diane Nash, and this is the day that the lunch counters were desegregated. The only reason I know the names of everybody here is because my brother and sister told me the names. I only knew Diane Nash. This is Diane Nash in 2013. And this is her 2 weeks ago with my sister, who's on the left. Diane Nash is on the right. Let me mention something about Diane Nash and why this is so critical. For me, she is a hero of the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement was a precursor to the women's movement, which means it was highly sexist. And because of that, most people don't know any of the women who were part of the civil rights movement. But Diane Nash, in my mind, was as important in the civil rights movement as anybody, as important as Martin Luther King. Again, just one of the unspoken people that you don't hear about. her life was on the line like everybody else's. Before she, if it wasn't for Diane Nash and John Lewis and the other group, the members of SNCC, the Freedom Ride would have been not a success. It would have been a total failure. So let me switch topics here. So this is 1977 to 78. I started working for what we call PRBA. And that's when I decided on the topic, through working at PRBA, to start studying older black Americans. And it wasn't until PRBA that I sort of got my feet, right? When I started understanding how important, when I started to become a researcher and not a student who really didn't know what he was doing. So part of the reason I started on older black Americans was due to my main mentor was James Jackson. But the other part, and probably the more important part, is because the girlfriend at that time also was doing research on older black Americans. It didn't hurt also that Harold Johnson also is a major figure in terms of work and the stature and fighting for the rights of older black Americans. And as you see here, before he was the Dean of School of Social Work, he was director of the Institute of Gerontology. But also, my mother, and that's my mother with a purple top. To the right side is my sister, Mary Ann. And this is an older relative. This picture is taken in April 1985. My mother was also a social worker. So I'm a second-generation social worker, and my son is a third-generation social worker. And later in her career, my mother started specializing with work on black elderly. And this is an article from the Nashville Tennessean publicizing my mother's a one-day conference on caregiving for older African American. So again, now we sort of have the topic of why I was going to study older blacks, but then the real key is, well, what do I study? All right. So I started studying Medicare and Medicaid. But as I was getting into this, what I found was this, and this is data from that period. So, number one, African Americans during this period had very high levels of poverty. So 1 out of 3 were poor. Had very low levels of formal education. The variety of reasons for that included segregated classrooms, being raised in states and counties where it was illegal to get an education or illegal to get an education above the 5th grade. That's one reason for a lot of migration also, was because of that. Very highly segregated, more than segregated schools. That really doesn't do justice. Sort of farmhouse schools, one-room schools, very poor schools. A combination of that. So what you see is very high levels, I said very poor socioeconomic status, very poor housing conditions, very poor health, low levels of health status. And what we also saw is this, more unemployment, more labor force dropout rates, more part-time work. I would love to say that this only held thin. This part right here still holds. So when I put all this together and I put in a lifetime of some level of chronic stress, high levels of poverty, high levels of discrimination, what I wanted to study was, well, how did this group cope? How did they survive this? And that's what got me to my research areas: African American families, African American religion. So those became my 2 research areas, mostly with older African Americans, but over time it's gone from both older African Americans and adult African Americans. This article right here was central to my development. I remember reading almost to the, I can almost close my eyes and see myself walking through ISR and saying, yes, this is what I'm going to do my dissertation on, based upon this article. Some of you may recognize the name Marjorie Cantor. Others may recognize her daughter's name, Nancy Cantor. I was fortunate to be involved with two national surveys. James Jackson is the principal investigator. And I want to talk a little bit about the National Survey of American Life real quick, just to set up what we're doing. These are the principal investigators. This is sample design, just in terms of the N. And again, what's interesting about our survey is the first one on Black Americans. I'm sorry, Black Caribbeans, very first. And let me mention one thing. Some of my most fun learning was sitting in on meetings developing this proposal. That was a period where James, as y'all probably know, travels all the time. David Williams travels all the time. Woody Neighbors at that point traveled all the time. Cleo Caldwell was traveling. And they knew everybody and everything going on in the field. And just sort of having these conversations was such an unbelievable amount of learning during that period. Well, we threw out all kind of just crazy ideas of things to do. You know, not only biomarker stuff, which we certainly couldn't afford, but things like, let's drop envelopes in the neighborhood and see if people mail them back. Just anything you could think of were things that we sort of threw out. This is the sampling area for the National Survey of American Life. As you see, it's tailored around the African American sample and the Black Caribbean sample, which means it's heavily in the Northeast and the South, in the Midwest, not in the upper Midwest, and a little bit on the West Coast. Again, 50% of all African Americans live in the South. Many people, the Black Caribbean population is thought of as an invisible population. And I would imagine many people here did not know that these individuals were all of Caribbean descent. And again, for older people, people like Stokely Carmichael and Farrakhan. For young people, Rihanna. Yeah, and for reality TV, Tanisha Thomas. Most people do not know Tanisha Thomas, and that's probably a good thing. I shouldn't tease with that. Tanisha Thomas is from the Bad Girls Club, so that gives you an idea. Okay, this again, a map showing the distribution of the Caribbean population in the United States during this period. Again, mostly heavily northeast, and then Florida, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, and a few major cities. Extremely diverse population. So I guess a few pictures just to give some understanding of the diversity. These are the countries that are most represented in our sample, and again, our sample matches up really well with the immigrant population at that point in time. And there's lots of Caribbean islands. I can't remember how many in terms of our sample, but there's probably 25 to 30 others. So with family research, I have two areas of research: the correlates of family support networks, and more recently, the impact of family emotional health and negative interaction on mental health. So I just want to talk a little bit about one paper. And so if you see a red highlight, that means it's a co-authored paper with a former doctoral student from the Joint Program. If it's a green highlight, it's a colleague here in the School of Social Work. And I did not highlight Linda's name because Linda is just on about 99% of all our articles together. So. Okay, I lost my monitor here. So these are, I just want to highlight some findings from one paper. Yeah, Stacy, we're not, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
So I can go ahead and talk.
Forgive me just a second. Preview. It's still not.
I was at a talk that James Jackson held, and there might have been 5 tech people, and then they said, just a major malfunction, and that was that. Okay.
I apologize.
can do- it's okay, I can do this. Yeah,
Locked up.
yeah. Okay. So, we'll go back for a second. Here's the paper again. It deals with family, friendship, fictive kin, and congregational informal support. I'm not going to talk about friendship or fictive kin today, just because of time. A little bit about congregational and a little bit about family. So from this paper, African Americans gave help to family members more often than they did than whites did, and more likely have daily interaction with with family members in comparison to non-Hispanic whites and Black Caribbeans. These are the findings, but in tabular form. So there's essentially a repeat of what I just said. I told my family I'm going to do my best to have a family-friendly, less data-based presentation. I figured they can travel from various places across the country. That's the least I could do. So, consistent with prior work, this is just a discussion of those findings. So consistent with prior work, it finds that African Americans have similar or higher levels of involvement. It refutes the notion. There was a lot of research coming out in the early 90s that Black families have weakened and the support networks have weakened. It totally refutes that notion. And also shows what we saw as more interaction in comparison to Black Caribbeans. And the reason why, if you know anything about Black Caribbeans families, they are highly dispersed. So in terms of immigrant families, one group of family members may immigrate to the United States. Another group may obviously stay home in, so we'll say Jamaica. But another group may immigrate to Toronto, and another group to London, as an example. So, and I also started doing some work on negative interaction in the last 6 years from using data from the National Center of American Life. My former student, Karen Lincoln, said you have to put these questions in. And this is the wave of family research in the future. And she was absolutely right. That and discrimination are 2 of our most powerful predictors of mental health and mental illness. This is a slide that shows you a variety of papers, and in each paper, negative interaction is significant. It's significant with poor mental health and lower levels of self-esteem, lower levels of life satisfaction, lower levels of happiness. But it's also positively related with more depression, more anxiety, more social anxiety, more suicidal attempts and suicidal ideations, and depressive symptoms. So I know I'm sort of flying through some things and just want to hit on some of the different areas, and then right at the end we'll sort of pull it together a little bit. So we also do some work on religious participation. When I started doing this, this is not what I really wanted to do. It just turned out that I wanted to do work on family support, and then it's like, wow, we have these questions on church support. So even though Linda Chatters and I are known for the research on church support, we really had to thank Phil Bowman and James Jackson, because they're the ones who put the questions in based on focus group comments. And so when I started this, I said, wow, there's no research on church support or congregational support. And then I said, okay, well, I'll look at research on religion. And it turns out there was very little research on African American religion, besides the fact that everybody says it's really important. Okay? So that's what everybody said, but people didn't know just the basic things. How often do African Americans go to religious services? How often do they pray? How often do they watch religious programming? Those types of issues. These, I'm not going to go through all of this, but we have papers on all of these issues. This is the kind of thing I promised I wouldn't tell my family. This is, again, a structural equation model, a measurement model of religious participation. And these are across a variety of papers, across different data sets, these are the basic findings. Women more religious, married more religious, Southerners, African Americans, and Black Caribbeans more religious than non-Hispanic whites. No major SES, no major urban-rural differences, and that always shocks people. People always assume that poor African Americans are more religious. We find very few differences, very few. There's one or two, but again, very few. And there's just about always a positive age relationship. Gender and age are probably the two strongest relationships. It's a little bit of data on spirituality. This looks at whether people are both religious and spiritual. Are they religious only, spiritual only, or neither? And what you see here, just in this 2x2 table, is African Americans are more likely to say both. Whites are more likely to say, least likely to say both. More likely to say they're spiritual only, and more likely to say neither. So I just want to talk again a little bit more about family, friendly, and congregation networks, and what are the differences and the similarities. Well, family networks is, as we sort of know, is that with a family in particular, those ties are permanent. So people may never know their father, never know their mother, and still feel a strong tie that I need to know who my mother is, I need to know who my father is. Friendship networks are opposite, totally voluntary. They come in and they go. Depends on your stage of life and what you're doing and where you move and things like that. And it emerges from a history of reciprocal assistance. Congregational networks are similar to friendship networks, but are obviously a bit different. These ties are voluntary. If there's a history of assistance, okay, and a history there. And that history is reinforced by churches, and in particular, most churches say that fellowship is important. It's important to say hello to people. It's important to greet people. The sharing of life events, especially funerals, definitely births, but especially funerals, and shared experiences in a religious setting. I have two focus groups, and these are African American men, essentially saying that these are men who don't have strong families or no families, but have said the church is their family. Their church members are their families. I'll let you read that. I did these focus groups with Woody Neighbors. And here's the next one. So again, here's a little bit of data in terms of church support variables. And what you'll see here is, well, with this one in particular, Black Caribbeans are the least likely to say nearly every day. Again, for our purposes, just look at the percentages that are highlighted. Black Caribbeans are more likely to say never, that they never receive support from their church members. And African Americans are more likely to say that they receive it very often. Again, in terms of giving support to church members, let me also mention that in order to respond to these questions, you have to attend religious services at least once a year. If you say you don't attend, then we don't ask you these questions, obviously. African Americans are more likely to say that they feel very close to their church members. But African Americans also have more negative interactions with the church members. Okay? Yeah, I see my sisters, shaking their heads. And again, it makes sense. Part of it is that the more interaction you have, the more the opportunity for negative interactions. I want to talk a little bit about this one study. Again, Amanda Woodward is a co-author, and Emily Nicolette, who's here, is a co-author. And here we looked at the center, the CESD, as a dependent variable. And these are the items of the CESD. Our form is an abbreviated CESD. It's not the full 16 measures. I think it's 12 indicators. We also use the K6, also known as the Kessler 6. And the CSD is a measure of depressive symptoms, where this is a measure of both depression and anxiety. These are the indicators of the K6. And these are the findings. So what we have is that emotional support from church members, congregational members, is inversely related to depressive symptoms and depression and anxiety. Negative interaction with church members was positively associated until we controlled for the family variables, and then the family variables also still come out. So number one, it still shows how toxic negative interaction with family members is. But it also shows how emotional support from family members is still, from church members is still important when you control for family support. The argument in all the previous research is that once you put in the family variables, all the religious variables will fall out. And clearly that was not the case that we showed with this paper. So my overall conclusion, and I was supposed to change, I have like 2 points here that I made mistakes on that you'll probably see, so it's one of 5 points. So I saw that like an hour before the presentation. I said, I'll change it, and obviously I forgot. So, and then overall conclusion. So number one, older African Americans in particular have survived in large part due to their families and to their religious participation. Negative interaction creates a toxic environment. That's one of the mistakes I made. And this environment is a risk factor for anxiety and depressive symptoms. Religious communities provide a sense of belonging, and it has a positive, for the most part, positive impact on mental health. And just to start from where we began, we're much further along than we were 50 years ago. So even though I talked about the negative things of when I was being raised, and even though we have still a long, long way to go, I do not want to underemphasize that. We are in much better shape than we were 50 years ago. Michigan in particular has had a strong commitment to diversity and inclusion. University of Michigan has produced more African American PhDs than any school in the country except for Howard University. Howard's number 1, Michigan is number 2. And Michigan is the only major school of social work that's ever had an African American dean. Matter of fact, we've had 2 African American deans, including our own Harold Johnson. So with this point, I want to conclude, and I just want to say I'm totally honored to be the Harold Johnson Chair. Yes, I may even have it in the next slide. Questions? Yes. Yeah.
What age do you find that the church support comes into play with the elderly?
That is a good question, and coming from a family member, too. Okay. There's no particular age. As a matter of fact, one of the issues is that churches have a tendency to put more emphasis on bringing in young members. So for a lot of older African Americans, they don't feel like they are supported as much as they would like. But in the same way, church members do a really good job of things. Again, I use our mother as an example, your grandmother as an example. She had, as she was older, she had a telephone chain. And so it was maybe 4, 5, 6 people every morning. They call each other, make sure everything was okay. And they were all church members. You know, because these were all older women who, for the most part, lived alone. And that's one of how they, you know, kept together. Other thing is that where churches are really good at, especially if there's an adult child at that church, that's how the person doesn't get forgotten about. So if there's an adult child at that church, it makes a big difference. If it's just a single older woman, as an example, over time, over a 5, 8-year time, they can easily be forgotten.
When you talked about the negative interactions with family members, did you see an incidence of more negative interactions and demands on the family member when they got more, like moved up, advancing in their career, or was it consistent over if we live in the same neighborhood or if you like move up? Like, does that make sense?
I would yeah, it does make sense.
Okay.
I would love to say we have data that's that dynamic. We don't. On the other hand, I can tell you based on our research and other research. So number one, a lot of this has to do with whether the individual may have a mental health or a drug abuse problem. That really creates that toxic environment. Sometimes it's people who are trying to help them. Sometimes it's people upset at them. Sometimes people take, you try to give what you think is good advice, but it's really harsh criticisms. And so that is all of that can create that environment. What I do know is this, though, that sort of directly gets at your question, not in terms of negative interaction, but there's a lot of research on wealth in black families. And what this research has found is that African Americans who are middle class are much more likely to give money to their family members than white Americans who are middle class. And what happens, so there's a positive benefits to that you're helping out family members. There are negative consequences to that, and that it decreases from wealth. Yeah.
It's often assumed that, and I don't know if this is true just of black church goers, but that pastors direct people to pray rather than to seek out professional help? And have you done any research on that? And if so, what have you found?
Yeah, we've done mostly with Harold Neighbors has probably one of the best pieces in the mid '80s on that. But we also, Woody and I have worked on some papers, and Amanda Woodward and I. And what we see is this: you're right, some do. So some totally say prayer. Some give extremely bad advice. But many others do really good advice. Part of it is based on the education level of the pastor. So you have to remember, especially if you're Baptist or Pentecostal, if you get the calling, you're a pastor, right? I could start a church right now with my family, and then we grab in 1 or 2 people, and we have a church. And you'll see that as you drive, there are places you'll see church service here, it could be a local school, as an example. So that's more the negative side. On the positive side, there are pastors who have divinity degrees, master's degrees. There are several schools that have joint programs with MSWs, so divinity and MSW, and many of them are absolutely excellent counselors. And pastors are extremely good at dealing with bereavement. So that is a strength that social workers and others have a hard time dealing with death. Well, the pastors can deal with it much better generally.
First, I just want to say thanks for that presentation. I'm really curious to hear, have you been able to look at interactions between family dynamics and church dynamics? And also, particularly since the study is longitudinal, if you looked at more like a process model, if family conflict tends to send older individuals to church maybe to help resolve those issues, and if that is kind of maybe a mediator that's helping processes overall, or I'm just curious to hear your thoughts.
Now, it's a great question. Again, our data is just not that dynamic to pick up on anything like that. But we do know is that there may be, I'm going to guess at the percentage, there may be 10% of people who say they do not receive support from their families but receive support from their church members. So there is a small group there. Now, some of it is because of bad relationships with their families. But sometimes, you have to be real here, there's some families that you want to isolate yourself from, okay? I hate to say it that way. So I'm going to give you a story about a friend of mine named Sam. He grew up in my neighborhood. Sam was an ex-con, but he wasn't the type to beat up people or rob people. Sam was a con man, and he just figured out ways to steal your money. And Sam lived in Milwaukee in the in the summer, and was in Florida where all the con people are in the winter, right? And I was visiting my mother, 1989, something like that, right? Hadn't seen Sam in a lot of years. Sam just got out of the pen. Sam was, one of Sam's characters was in a movie, though that's an aside here. So Sam told me he and his little brother, he had 2 brothers, and Sam and his brother were at my house, and both of them weren't doing much, up to no good. And they were saying, yeah, I can't believe James. I can't believe James. He doesn't like to hang out with us. He doesn't like doing it. He just doesn't want to be with us at all. And I'm saying to myself, yeah, I wouldn't want to be with y'all either, And he clearly isolated himself. And he had to, unless he'd be in prison too, guaranteed. They would store some money at his house. They would do something that would get him in prison. So I guess that's just one example, one neighborhood example. I don't think any of my family knew Sam. My sister that I'm closest to was probably protected. She was in the house all the time. I was running the streets.
I want to echo your comment. Thank you so much, especially for the front end of your presentation. That gives some historical context. I think it's immensely important and informative. I was wondering whether, I really am so fascinated by your research on religion, and I'm wondering if you find gender differences.
I'm sorry, Marilyn, gender differences in
does
what?
it work different? Does religion work differently for males than it does for females, or has that been looked at?
We've looked at it. Matter of fact, there have been lots of papers on it. So what you find is that it almost doesn't matter what the indicator is. Women are more religious than men. Okay, the only thing where you see a real dominant, a real difference, whereas men, is that men have all the power positions. But women pray more, women look at, I mean, you name it. Every indicator, women are more religious. Now, so people have tried to explain that. And there's maybe 5 years in the American Sociological Review. 1 year there'll be a paper saying this is the explanation for it. There's a highly sophisticated analysis. And then the next year there'll be another paper, highly sophisticated, saying that paper was wrong. And there's maybe 3 or 4 years of that, okay? And the bottom line is people are trying to explain away a difference, but it's just a true difference, okay? Women bond more, women are the kin keepers, women interact with family members more, and women are more religious. And I don't need an explanation of why. We just know that is a true gender difference. And we can't say it's because all these other things. Well, women are in this occupation and men in this occupation. All these things that people try to explain, none of it's worked out.
So just as a follow-up to that, because women are more religious, do they accrue the benefits of that as being less anxious, less depression, and on and on?
For the most part, yes. But again, it's what the researchers say in this field is you just can't turn it on. So you just can't say, okay, I have this serious illness, so now I'm going to start going to church, and this will make me better. It's a lifelong thing, okay? Now, it doesn't mean that you won't get some assistance, you won't get some help, but it's not something you just sort of instantly turn on and turn off. That, again, anybody who is highly religious would tell you that you just can't turn it on and off. But there are clear benefits, without a doubt. Part of it is just having another strong support network.
I'm also interested in how religion and religiosity changes in older adulthood. You addressed it, but I'd like a little bit more, please.
I'm sorry, Emily, say that again.
I'm interested in how religion and religiosity change once African Americans become older adults.
Okay. So you're talking about change. Again, our data is not dynamic, but there are some differences. Historically, what you saw is older African Americans were more likely to look at religious programs, and younger people were more likely to read. But that difference is changing as the cohort who had low levels of education have died off, and other cohorts have higher levels of education or are getting older. Probably the biggest, I'm not saying it's a difference, is that a lot of times you don't see big health differences, because for people who are very religious, if they don't do anything in the week, they will go to church. My brother-in-law, former brother-in-law, who passed about almost 20 years ago, 18 years ago, he suffered from cancer for years, but he would pull himself together to make sure he was at religious services every week. Though that next day, that Monday, he would be in bed all day. Well, I'll let this be the last question based on time.
You can take the last question, because I don't have a question.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. I want to go back to your findings related to negative interaction with family members. Some years ago, I published a study which older adults in China. What I found is that negative interaction is very powerful in predicting their depressive symptoms, but more so for people who are older. Among the older populations, the older one are more sensitive to the effect of negative family interaction. And my interpretation was kind of within the cultural context. When you get, there's no pension, no social security system in China. So you count on your family much more, when you are older, more frail conditions. But I don't know, whether you have thought about this question or data can find out.
That is a great question, because I haven't looked at that. What we find over and over, I know that Woody wants to talk, because I know Woody. But hold on, let me finish answering Lydia's question. So what I do know is this, is that for all of our findings, it doesn't matter how old you are, negative interaction is just toxic, okay? But we're not sure exactly where it comes from in terms of that dynamic. So sometimes it's coming from the family member trying to push a person to do something that they can't do. So if you're depressed, they're saying, "Oh, just get out of bed, you'll be okay," or "You need to pull yourself together," and there are things like that. So, but sometimes it's also the person who's depressed who's seeing what could be really good advice as very negative. So it's that combination. I'm working on a paper with Joe Hemley now on families and OCD, and none of the family and friendship variables are significant except for family negative interaction. That's the only one that's significant. Yeah. Dr. Neighbors.
I actually just thought of a question. I'm curious about the operational definition of older. No, don't answer that. Don't answer that. So, no, I don't have a question, just a comment. I think just sitting here, taking that stroll down memory lane with you, I really appreciate the presentation and all the memories that just came flooding back to me, because you and I have been doing this together for a long time, going back to the 70s, and so it's just really amazing and immensely impressive to remember where it started and today, not that it's ended today, but just to see how far your career has come. I'm sure you remember the early days of the NSBA. We actually shared a very small office.
Very small office, yeah. If you lean back, we'd hit each other.
Yeah. And there were 3 of us in that office. But I don't really have any negative memories of that experience. It was just a lot of fun. I think we were all highly committed to the mission. And today, I think you've given us a very clear understanding of what that mission was. And, of course, hats off to James Jackson for coming up with the crazy idea of a national survey of black Americans. And that was pretty crazy back in the 70s, but it's just really impressive to see, how you took your piece of that and just really ran with it. So I just want to say, probably channeling everybody who's been a part of PRBA over the years, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's all congratulate Robert Joseph Taylor on his installation into the Harold R. Johnson Professor of Social Work Endowed Chair. We're so, so proud of you, Robert.
Thank you.
Congratulations. There's a reception just at the back of the room here. I hope you can stay and spend a little time socializing with Robert and his relatives. And thank you all for coming.